Hey guys, it's Paradise, and after the massive changes of the recent patch which buffed and nerfed different weapons, we need to take a closer look at the Carian Sorcery sword. If you don't know, this is an interesting new weapon added into Shadow of the Erdtree, acting as both an intelligence sword but also a staff all in one. Basically, it's a weapon that also lets you cast sorceries. However, before the patch, this had absolutely awful scaling with int at C and nearly no sorcery scaling at all for the actual sorcery spells, making it nearly useless even though the concept was pretty cool. But the new patch has buffed this sword all the way up to S tier in int scaling and has improved its sorcery scaling on top. With this being such a cool concept and allowing you to use it as a weapon and staff together, we wanted to know, is this viable and can it work for a build that is actually good? There's some high competition with intelligence, having weapons like the Moonveil Katana that is exceptional, and other staffs like the Carian Regal Scepter being also very good at high int levels, so we've done a bunch of testing to figure out, can or should you use the Carian Sorcery sword? If you don't have the Carian Sorcery sword, you can actually get it quite easily close to the High Road Cross Grace Point. Just follow this route. So hop onto your mount, and what we want to do is basically go straight west. There'll be a cliff to jump down that will lead into a sort of water area, so go a little north until you can safely make the fall with just a little bit of damage, obviously heal up that damage, and then head south following the water towards Castle Ensis. You'll see a waterfall, and right at the waterfall just take a right along these rocks until you can see a safe part to drop down on top of the castle. The chest is actually really easy to grab here. Once you land, you will be dismounted. Just run forwards and to the left, and here you can see on the eastern side of the wall there'll be a chest in the middle, and this will have the sword for us. Now, the main gimmick of this sword is the fact that you can hit with it as a weapon and cast with it, effectively freeing up a secondary hand for something like a shield, allowing you to cast, attack, and block all in the same build. But this sword is really odd even after the buff. It effectively is only the optimal spellcasting option at exactly 41 intelligence. After this, it starts to drop off dramatically against the other better staffs in the game, and before this, it's not as good as the other staffs in the game. So there is a certain stat line where you have 41 intelligence and this sword is best, but there's no real build where you want to sit at 41 int, especially as most players level up to 150 and then stay there. So there's no reason to nerf yourself at 41 int in order to optimally use the sword. However, if other staffs start to dramatically outperform it at higher int levels, what this could have potentially meant is that this sword may be a good staff for the hybrid spellcasting sorceries, like the Faith sorceries or the Arcane sorceries. So we started by making a hybrid intelligence Faith build, trying out both the old and new Faith sorceries, with things like the new Putrescent sorceries as well as the Rancor sorceries, to see if this would actually be viable and good. Now, unfortunately for this type of build with this sword, what we found is that it effectively just wasn't that good. The damage output wasn't super high, and there was only really one outcome where it was sort of usable, and that was with the explosive Ghost Flame. But even in this scenario with the Prince of Death staff in our offhand for the passive bonus to death sorcery, the damage just wasn't good enough. So what you would need to do is boost your stats further, and thus you would end up switching over to a different staff to just get the better scaling. After this, we tried a full intelligence build, going more down a traditional int mage route. What this meant is that we could utilize our shield, the actual attacks of the sword, and still spellcast. But in practice, the actual damage of the sword wasn't really that massive, especially compared to something like Moonveil. The blocking of the shield wasn't super useful because you just don't have that much stamina to actually tank the hits, and then the actual damage of the spellcasting suffered greatly because the actual scaling on the sword for sorceries just isn't that good at high levels of int compared to something like the Carian Regal Scepter. So even for full int builds, this thing kind of still didn't work and doesn't have a place. So then, as a last-ditch effort, we tried the Arcane sorceries, making a sort of int-arcane hybrid, and what we actually saw with this is something in line with the base game, where a lot of these kind of sorceries just weren't actually that good compared to going full int anyway in terms of your pure DPS output. So, while this was able to kill some mobs, it was a very weird playstyle and just didn't outperform other methods and builds for the same stat investment. So I do think the weapon is really interesting and I'm glad they buffed it, but I feel like it is in need of a further buff. This is because at the moment, with its S tier in int scaling, you're effectively forced to level up your int as high as possible to actually improve the damage of the sword. But once you start to go over 41 int, the other staffs become much better spellcasting options, so you would never want to cast with this sword at higher int levels, which you need to improve its damage and its scaling. So at the moment, it's in a kind of weird place where in theory it's really cool, but in order to actually utilize it, you need to go very heavily into int, in which case you're obviously going to use a staff because you can deal way more damage with your spells when using a staff. And then the actual damage of the sword is a little lackluster, so I do think this needs a further buff. But what do you think? Have you tried it out? What's your thoughts? Tell us down below. These are our findings. Drop a like and let us know if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe for more coming your way very, very soon.